The sand was red that morning, stained not by dawn but by the blood of men who believed they were invisible to history. February 1943. Tunisia. The Kasserine Pass. American forces were being obliterated by Rommel's Afrika Corps, torn apart like paper dolls in a hurricane, and somewhere in that chaos, hunched over a makeshift table inside a half-collapsed supply tent, a black engineer named Sergeant Cornelius Hayes was drawing lines in the dirt that would rewrite the entire North African campaign. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, though fear was everywhere, thick as the diesel smoke choking the air. His hands shook because he knew what he was about to propose would either save thousands of lives or get him court-martialed as a lunatic. Maybe both. And the worst part, the part that made his jaw clench until his teeth hurt, was that no one in command would listen to a Negro sergeant from Georgia who'd learned demolitions by blowing stumps on his grandfather's farm. But the panzers were coming. They were always coming. And someone had to do something before there was nothing left of the American army in North Africa but dog tags and regret. Hayes had arrived in North Africa 3 months earlier with the 96th Engineer Battalion, a segregated unit tasked with the jobs white soldiers didn't want to do: digging latrines, building roads, hauling supplies through minefields while officers looked the other way. The army didn't trust black men with weapons, but they were perfectly happy to send them into the desert with shovels and pray they didn't die too loudly. Hayes was 28 years old, built like a tree that refused to bend, with eyes that seemed to calculate angles and trajectories even when he was just looking at you. Before the war, he'd been working on a master's degree in civil engineering at Tuskegee Institute, one of the few places in America where a black man could study such things without being chased off campus. He understood load-bearing structures, hydraulic pressure, the way force moved through materials like water through stone. He understood how things broke. And in Tunisia in the winter of 1943, everything was breaking. The disaster had begun days earlier when German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched a massive assault through the Kasserine Pass, a 20-mile-wide gap in the Atlas Mountains that served as the gateway to Algeria. American troops, green and untested, had been positioned there by commanders who underestimated both the enemy and the terrain. When the panzers rolled through, supported by Stuka dive bombers that screamed out of the sky like mechanical demons, the Americans collapsed. Entire battalions disintegrated. Men threw down their rifles and ran. Tanks were abandoned, still running, crews fleeing into the desert without looking back. It was a massacre dressed up as a retreat, and by February 19th, Rommel's forces had pushed 25 miles into Allied territory, threatening to split the entire Allied position in North Africa and possibly knock the United States out of the war before it had properly begun. Eisenhower was furious. Churchill was panicking. And in Washington, officials were quietly discussing what it would mean if America's first major ground engagement with Germany ended in catastrophic defeat. Hayes had watched it all unfold from a supply depot 10 miles behind the lines, watching truck after truck arrive loaded with wounded men who'd been shredded by 88mm shells, their faces blank with shock, some of them weeping, others silent in a way that suggested they'd left pieces of themselves back in the pass and would never be whole again. The 96 had been ordered to prepare defensive positions, which meant digging trenches that everyone knew wouldn't matter when the panzers arrived. Tanks didn't care about trenches. They rolled over them, crushing men and earth together into a kind of mud that couldn't be separated. Hayes had seen it happen. He'd pulled a man out of a collapsed trench once, or what was left of a man, and the memory lived behind his eyes like a photograph he couldn't burn. But Hayes had also seen something else. He'd been surveying the terrain east of Kasserine, mapping potential supply routes, when he'd noticed the way the landscape was structured. The pass itself was a natural funnel, mountains on either side forcing traffic through a relatively narrow corridor, and the desert floor was crisscrossed with wadis, dried riverbeds that cut through the ground like surgical incisions. The wadis were deep, some of them 8 or 10 feet with steep sides and rocky bottoms, and they formed a kind of network, a hidden system of channels that the panzers would have to cross if they continued their advance. Hayes had stood there in the wind, feeling the sun burn the back of his neck, and he'd thought about water, about how water finds the path of least resistance, about how you could redirect it, control it, turn it into a weapon if you understood the topography, and then he'd thought about something else, something his grandfather had taught him back in Georgia, a technique called daisy chaining, where you'd link multiple explosive charges together so that one detonation would trigger the next, creating a cascade effect that could clear an entire field in seconds. That night, Hayes had approached his commanding officer, Captain William Driscoll, a man from Connecticut who treated his black subordinates with a kind of weary tolerance, as if they were children who needed constant supervision, but occasionally said something amusing. Hayes had explained his idea. He wanted to place pipe bombs, improvised explosive devices constructed from steel pipes filled with captured German ordnance and scrap metal, along the wadis east of Kasserine. The charges would be connected by detonation cord hidden beneath sand and camouflage, and when Rommel's panzers advanced through the area, Hayes would trigger the network, collapsing the wadis and creating massive craters that would immobilize the German armor and funnel them into pre-sighted artillery kill zones. It was ambitious. It was dangerous. It required precise timing, expert knowledge of explosives, and a level of tactical coordination that most officers wouldn't trust to a sergeant, let alone a Negro sergeant. Driscoll had listened with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, and when Hayes finished, the captain had said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You want to booby-trap half the desert with homemade bombs and hope the Germans drive over them at exactly the right moment. Are you out of your goddamn mind?" Hayes had kept his face neutral, his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, the panzers are going to push through here within 48 hours. Our defensive positions won't hold. We don't have enough anti-tank guns, and the infantry's already demoralized. But if we can disrupt their armor even for a few hours, it gives our artillery time to reposition and our infantry time to dig in properly. The wadis are a natural choke point. We'd be using the terrain against them, the same way Hannibal used the terrain at Cannae." He'd regretted the historical reference immediately. Officers didn't like it when enlisted men, especially black enlisted men, demonstrated education. It made them uncomfortable, reminded them that the racial hierarchy they'd built their lives around was arbitrary and fragile. Driscoll had stared at him for a long moment, then shaken his head. "I'm not authorizing this. It's insane, it's probably impossible, and even if it worked, you'd probably blow up half our own guys in the process. Forget it, Sergeant. Get back to your unit and focus on the defensive positions." Hayes had saluted and left, his chest tight with frustration, knowing that men were going to die because someone in command couldn't see past the color of his skin. But he hadn't forgotten the idea. He'd gone back to his tent and spent the night doing calculations, sketching diagrams, working out the logistics of what he was proposing. The math worked, the physics worked. The only thing that didn't work was the chain of command. The next morning, February 20th, the situation had deteriorated even further. German reconnaissance units had been spotted less than 5 miles from the supply depot, and there were reports of panzer columns massing for a final push that would break through the remaining American defenses and open the road to Tebessa, a critical logistics hub that supplied the entire Allied front. If Tebessa fell, the campaign was over. Hayes had been loading equipment onto trucks, preparing for evacuation, when he'd overheard 2 white officers talking near a command vehicle. They were discussing artillery placement, debating whether to fall back or try to hold the line, and one of them had said something that made Hayes stop moving. "The wadis," the officer had said. "If we had any way to block those wadis, we could slow them down, force them to bunch up. But we don't have time to mine the area properly, and even if we did, the Germans would just clear the mines." Hayes had set down the crate he was carrying and walked over to the officers, knowing he was violating protocol, knowing he could be disciplined or worse, but unable to stay silent. "Sir," he'd said, addressing a major he didn't recognize, "I have a plan to block those wadis. It would take approximately 6 hours to implement and would require 20 men. 500 feet of detonation cord and access to the captured German munitions we're storing in the western depot." The major had looked at him like he'd just materialized out of thin air, surprised and vaguely annoyed. "Who the hell are you?" Hayes had identified himself, explained his background, and then, before anyone could stop him, had launched into a detailed explanation of his proposal, speaking quickly and precisely, using technical language that made it clear he knew exactly what he was talking about. The major, whose name was Robert Shaw, had listened with growing interest, occasionally interrupting to ask questions about blast radius, detonation timing, and safety protocols. Shaw was a West Point graduate, an engineer himself before the war, and he understood what Hayes was describing in a way that Driscoll hadn't. When Hayes finished, Shaw had turned to Driscoll and asked, "Why wasn't I informed about this plan earlier?" Driscoll had stammered something about it being impractical, but Shaw had cut him off. "Impractical? Captain, we're about to lose this entire sector because we don't have a way to stop their armor. If this sergeant has a solution, I want to hear it, and I want to see his calculations." Hayes had produced his notebook, pages covered in diagrams and equations, and Shaw had reviewed them right there in the dust and chaos, his eyes moving rapidly across the figures. Finally, he'd looked up and said, "This could work. It's risky as hell, but it could work. Sergeant, you have 6 hours and whatever resources you need. If you can pull this off, you might just save this whole goddamn army. And if you can't, well, we were all going to die anyway, so we've got nothing to lose." He'd turned to Driscoll. Captain, assign him 20 of your best men and get him access to that munitions depot immediately. The next 6 hours had been a controlled frenzy. Hayes had selected his team carefully, choosing men from the 96th who had experience with demolitions and who trusted him enough to follow his lead even when the plan seemed insane. There was Corporal James Mitchell from Detroit, who'd worked in an auto plant and understood mechanical systems. Private Leroy Thompson from Mississippi, who'd been a coal miner and knew how to set charges in tight spaces. Sergeant First Class Eugene Washington from Philadelphia, who'd been a construction foreman and could manage logistics under pressure. These were men who'd been told their entire lives that they weren't smart enough, brave enough, good enough, and who'd come to North Africa determined to prove otherwise, even if no one ever acknowledged it. They'd worked through the afternoon hauling steel pipes, packing them with captured German explosive charges, rigging detonation cord in patterns that would ensure simultaneous detonation across multiple points. The wadis were spread across 3 miles of desert, and Hayes had positioned the charges at strategic locations where the German tanks would be most vulnerable, where the collapsed earth would create obstacles that couldn't be bypassed. He'd calculated the blast sequences to create a cascading effect, each explosion triggering sensors that would ignite the next series of charges, turning the entire network into a single massive trap. It was engineering and art and desperation all woven together. And as the sun began to set and German artillery started pounding positions to the west, Hayes had stood at the detonation point. A crude electrical trigger rigged to a truck battery, and wondered if he'd just wasted the last hours of his life on a fantasy. The panzers had come at dawn, 25 divisions of German armor rolling through the desert like a steel tide. Their engines roaring, their commanders confident that nothing could stop them now. The Americans were broken. The British were retreating. North Africa was Rommel's, and after North Africa would come Egypt, and after Egypt, who knew? Perhaps the war itself could be won in the desert. The lead elements of the German column had entered the Wadi network at 0600 hours. Following the natural terrain, their crews relaxed. Some of them probably thinking about breakfast or letters from home or anything except the possibility that the ground beneath them was about to become a grave. Hayes had waited, crouched behind a rocky outcropping 200 yards from the trigger point, watching through binoculars as the panzers moved into position. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. Beside him, Washington had whispered, "How many you think are out there?" Hayes hadn't answered immediately, just kept counting vehicles, watching the column stretch into the distance like a metal snake. "Enough," he'd finally said. More than enough. He'd waited until the maximum number of vehicles were positioned over the wadis until the timing was perfect, and then he'd crawled back to the trigger, placed his hand on the detonator lever, and for just a moment, he'd thought about his grandfather, about the old man teaching him to read blast patterns in tree stumps, about how destruction and creation were sometimes the same thing if you understood the purpose behind the force. Then he'd pushed the lever down. The earth had erupted. Not one explosion, but dozens. Hundreds. A symphony of destruction that rolled across the desert in waves. Each detonation triggering the next until the entire network was alight with fire and flying metal. The wadis had collapsed exactly as Hayes had calculated. Massive craters opening beneath the panzers, swallowing them whole or tipping them sideways. Treads spinning uselessly as the vehicles became trapped in holes that were suddenly 15 feet deep. Steel pipes filled with shrapnel had detonated in the midst of the German formations, shredding infantry support units, destroying fuel trucks, creating chaos that spread like a virus through the entire column. German commanders had screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the roar of continuing explosions, and as the dust began to settle, American artillery had opened up, pre-sighted guns, launching shell after shell into the confused mass of trapped armor, methodically destroying vehicle after vehicle while German crews scrambled to escape or return fire or simply understand what had happened. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which had been a catastrophic defeat for American forces, had suddenly become something else. The German advance had stalled. Rommel's armor, which had seemed unstoppable, was now immobilized, caught in a killing field that stretched for miles. American infantry, seeing the panzers trapped and burning, had found their courage again, launching counterattacks that pushed the Germans back toward the pass. British reinforcements, which had been held in reserve, had moved forward to exploit the breakthrough. And somewhere in the chaos, buried in after-action reports that would be filed and forgotten, was a notation that Sergeant Cornelius Hayes of the 96th Engineer Battalion had successfully implemented improvised area denial tactics resulting in significant enemy casualties and operational disruption. In the days that followed, the full extent of what had happened became clear. The German offensive had been broken. Rommel had been forced to retreat, his forces mauled and demoralized, his reputation as an invincible commander permanently damaged. The Americans had held North Africa. The path to Sicily and Italy remained open, and the entire strategic calculus of the war had shifted because one black engineer from Georgia had understood terrain and physics better than anyone in command had thought possible. Major Shaw had recommended Hayes for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, noting in his report that Sergeant Hayes demonstrated exceptional courage, technical expertise, and tactical innovation under extreme combat conditions, directly contributing to the successful defense of Allied positions and the prevention of catastrophic losses. The recommendation had been denied, not because Hayes didn't deserve it, but because the Army in 1943 couldn't stomach the idea of awarding its second highest honor to a Negro soldier. It would raise questions. It would upset the racial order that the military depended on. It would suggest that black men were capable of the kind of brilliance and heroism that the nation reserved for white men. So instead, Hayes had received a Bronze Star, a respectable but far less prestigious award, and had been quietly transferred to another unit, away from the officers who'd witnessed what he'd accomplished, away from the men who might tell stories that contradicted the official narrative. The Army had taken his victory and buried it beneath paperwork and silence, the way they'd buried so many other inconvenient truths about black soldiers and black courage and black genius that couldn't be acknowledged without dismantling the lies that America told itself. Hayes had returned to the United States in late 1944, after serving through the Italian campaign and into France, and he'd gone back to Tuskegee to finish his degree. He'd never talked about Kasserine Pass, never mentioned the pipe bombs or the panzers or the 6 hours that had changed the course of the war. When people asked about his Bronze Star, he'd shrug and say he'd done his job, nothing more. He'd become a civil engineer, designed bridges in Alabama and Georgia, structures that were still standing decades later, and he'd raised 3 children who never knew their father had once destroyed 25 German divisions with improvised explosives and mathematics. He'd died in 1987 at the age of 72, and his obituary in the local paper had mentioned his engineering career and his service in World War II, but had said nothing about Tunisia or Rommel or the moment when a black sergeant had saved an army that didn't think he was worthy of carrying a rifle. The truth had emerged slowly, the way truth often does, buried in declassified documents and forgotten after action reports and interviews with veterans who'd been there and remembered things differently than the official history suggested. Historians had pieced it together, connecting dots that the Army had tried to keep separate, and gradually the story had come into focus. The crazy pipe bomb network that destroyed German armor at Kasserine Pass, the black engineer who'd been ignored until desperation forced the Army to listen. The moment when genius and courage had intersected in the desert and changed everything. It was a story that should have been told immediately, should have been celebrated, should have made Hayes a national hero. But it hadn't been told because the nation wasn't ready to hear it. Wasn't willing to admit that the men it had relegated to the back of the bus and the bottom of the social hierarchy were capable of saving everyone else. There's a photograph of Hayes taken sometime in 1943, standing beside a half-track in Tunisia, his uniform dusty, his face expressionless, his eyes focused on something beyond the camera's frame. If you look closely, you can see his hands. Calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd built things and destroyed things and understood that sometimes those were the same act. You can see the intelligence in his posture, the way he holds himself like someone who knows his worth even when the world refuses to acknowledge it. And if you know the story, if you understand what those hands accomplished in the wadis east of Kasserine Pass, the photograph becomes something else. It becomes evidence, proof, that history is written by people who have the luxury of choosing what to remember and what to forget. Proof that heroism has always been color-coded in America, distributed according to a hierarchy that has nothing to do with courage or sacrifice or the content of anyone's character. The men of the 96th Engineer Battalion, the men who'd hauled pipes through the desert and rigged explosives under fire and trusted Hayes when no one else would, they'd known the truth. They'd carried it with them through the rest of the war and into the decades that followed. And some of them had told their children and grandchildren about the sergeant, who'd saved the Army with math and homemade bombs. But their testimony had been dismissed or ignored, filed away under Negro folklore or exaggeration because the narrative couldn't accommodate the reality of what had happened. The narrative required black soldiers to be support troops, laborers, second-class participants in a white man's war. It couldn't handle the idea that a black engineer had outhought every white officer in theater, and had saved thousands of lives through sheer technical brilliance. That story didn't fit, so it had been erased. But truth has a way of surviving, It persists in the margins, in the testimonies that don't make it into textbooks, in the memories of people who were there and refuse to forget. And eventually, if enough time passes and enough people are willing to listen, the truth emerges. Not complete, never complete, but enough to challenge the official version. Enough to force a reckoning with what was done and what was denied and who paid the price for America's refusal to see its black soldiers as equals. Cornelius Hayes saved the North African campaign. He stopped Rommel. He gave the Allies time to regroup and counterattack and ultimately win. And for decades, no one knew his name. That's the real story of Kasserine Pass. Not just the battle itself, not just the tactical details or the strategic implications, but the erasure that followed. The deliberate forgetting of a black hero because his existence complicated the narrative. The system that awarded him a lesser medal because the greater one would have required the army to admit that race had nothing to do with capability. The decades of silence that followed his return. The quiet life of a man who'd accomplished something extraordinary and had been told it didn't matter. And underneath all of it, the persistent, aching question that haunts every story of black service in World War II. How many other heroes were there? How many other moments of genius and courage were buried and forgotten? How many other men and women saved lives or changed outcomes or demonstrated excellence that couldn't be acknowledged because the country they were fighting for couldn't see them as fully human? Hayes' story demands more than recognition. It demands a reckoning with everything we think we know about World War II and heroism and who gets to be remembered. It demands that we ask harder questions about the official histories, that we listen to the voices that were silenced, that we understand that every gap in the record is an intentional erasure. Because the bombs that Hayes built in the desert, the improvised weapons that destroyed an entire German offensive, they weren't anomalies. They were proof of what black soldiers could do when given the chance, when desperation finally overcame prejudice. When survival required the army to acknowledge that excellence doesn't have a color. And the fact that we're only learning the story now 8 decades later is proof of how hard the system worked to keep that truth hidden. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive, stories that were deliberately buried, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about courage and sacrifice and who gets to be called a hero. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you think about Cornelius Hayes and the 96th Engineer Battalion. Tell us if you've heard other stories like this, stories of black soldiers whose brilliance was erased from the record. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. Heroes who saved armies and won battles and demonstrated genius under fire, only to be forgotten because the nation they fought for couldn't bear to remember them. These stories matter. They've always mattered. And it's long past time we started telling them the way they deserve to be told.